In today's video, we're taking a look at the future of Kakko with the New York Rangers. Did the Game 6 scratch have any meaning to it? Could his future in New York actually be questionable at this point? We'll discuss that scenario. Plus, it sounds like John Gibson might be wanting out of the Anaheim Ducks organization. There is conflicting reports and some details on that. And plus, Josh Anderson of the Montreal Canadiens appears to be gaining interest from around the league. Not clear if the Habs are wanting to trade him, but there is lots of interest. Plus, we have some signings as well. All that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a variety of NHL news and rumors to take a look at here today. First up, we have some signings to discuss. Edmonton Oilers goaltender Mikko Koskinen has officially signed a contract with the team in the Swiss League. We reported back a couple weeks ago that there was a rumored situation where he was heading over there. That's now officially official. So Mikko Koskinen no longer in the NHL, signs a 2-year contract in the Swiss League. I would say, based on how things went, probably doubtful that he ever tries to make an NHL return, but you just never know. The Vancouver Canucks have signed what I'd call an interesting prospect. They've signed a Swedish prospect defenseman, Philip Johansson. Now, he was one of the players we had talked about at the end of May that had to be signed or his rights was going to expire with his current NHL club. So that was the Minnesota Wild, who actually selected him as a first-round pick back in 2018. Now, the defenseman was never signed and certainly, I guess you could say, stalled in his development. The Wild really weren't thrilled with how things had gone, so they never signed him. I believe they did make an offer at one point, but there was never an agreement in place. So I do believe they're getting a draft pick as compensation for that. That is one of the kind of loopholes in the CPA, that if you have a first-round pick like that an offer is made and they go unsigned after their rights expire, you do get a pick back as compensation. So we'll see what they do with that pick. But in this case, the defenseman, I guess, might be a little bit of a late bloomer. Like I said, he's 22 years old now. He's played in the SHL the past 3 years. He's 6'1", 176. Reportedly a good defensive defenseman. That's the kind of what was the scouting report that I read on him. But he's certainly shown a little bit more of an offensive ability, especially this year in the SHL playoffs. So I think it's fair to say that this guy is worth taking a chance on, and we'll see where it goes. But another European prospect for the Vancouver Canucks. And then we did get a signing as well out of Nashville that was just recently announced right before I went to hit record here, actually. But they are extending defenseman Jeremy Lauzon. He's signing a 4-year contract valued at a total of $8 million for an average annual value of $2 million per season. So we know Lauzon's bounced around here a little bit in the past year. Of course, he was at Boston, got selected in the expansion draft at Seattle, ended up on waivers, moved around, ended up in Nashville, and looks like he'll be calling Nashville home here for some time. So that's a pretty decent contract for him. It gives them some long-term stability for a third-pair guy. And also reports are that the Edmonton Oilers forward Derek Brassard, who's been a bit of a journeyman here in the past probably 4 to 5 seasons, is contemplating retirement. Of course, he started his career as a Columbus Blue Jacket, ended up with the New York Rangers, then on to Ottawa, and during those 3 stints, he really had a lot of playoff action, was known as Big Game Brassard for a long time because he seemed to come up big in the playoffs, especially during his time with the Rangers, but certainly had a good run for a few years in Ottawa too. And after he left Ottawa, he's really bounced around significantly. I think it's been like 8 teams in 5 or 6 years or whatever it's been. It's been pretty crazy. He's been signing a lot of short-term deals and then getting traded at the deadline. Seems to be the habit he's been into, and most recently here finished this season out with the Oilers, but was basically a spare part, rarely played down the stretch in the playoffs. So he has battled his fair share of injuries as of late too, including a few hip injuries, which I know are not easy to overcome. So we'll see. It doesn't mean for sure that he will, but there are reports that he's contemplating it, and this could be the end of the road for the long-time NHL forward. Now, as I mentioned on the rumor mill section of today's video, we're basically going to look at 3 different players, and let's get started first up with Rangers youngster and former number 2 overall pick, Kakko. Now, of course, Kakko is now a pending restricted free agent, so obviously he needs a new deal. But the big, I guess, item here that's getting the most attention is the fact that he was a healthy scratch for Game 6 against the Tampa Bay Lightning, which ultimately ended up being the Rangers' final game of their 21-22 campaign and their quest for the Stanley Cup and winning the Eastern Conference here. Now, of course, so for a good stretch of time in the playoffs, the kid line, which featured Kakko along with number 1 overall pick, 1 year apart, Alexis Lafreniere and former first rounder Philip Hedl, they played a good role. They actually had some good chemistry together, and as someone pointed out, sometimes younger players like that do play better together because they feel like they're more on an even level playing field rather than if they're with a veteran player that they always want to defer to. It doesn't always work that way. Depends on the players, depends on their level of confidence and everything, but for some guys that can certainly hold true. Not the first time in the NHL that we've seen like a kid line be a big proponent of a team success. But that all kind of came to a crashing halt here in Game 6 when Gerard Gallant opted to scratch Kakko and not put him in the lineup. Now, of course, it's one thing to not be in the lineup, but it's not just the how here, it's also the why and what went into this decision. Now, of course, originally Gallant was asked about it, and he wouldn't talk about it. Now that the season's over, he did talk about it a little bit today, and he essentially said that it was just a hockey decision, and he was putting together his lineup that he felt gave the team the best chance to win. Basically, it just kind of sums it up, which is what you get a lot from coaches, and that's, there was really no more to it than that. Now, he also did say that he fully suspects that players like Lafreniere and Kakko will get an even bigger role next year. And he said, I believe, I'm not going to quote him, but I'll paraphrase, which I believe his words were that he would be surprised if they didn't have a more consistent top 6 role next season. So certainly that's encouraging, I guess, in a sense, but the healthy scratch is getting all the news and getting a lot of the attention from media and different writers that cover the New York Rangers. Now, of course, it's not just the fact that Kakko was scratched, because really, if you look at the 3 kid players on the kid line, he probably was the weaker player, I guess. Now, I don't really think any of them were playing poorly, but I guess Hedl and Lafreniere were contributing maybe a little bit more, I guess might be fair to say, but I don't really think Kakko was playing poorly. But the other part of this is how they went about replacing him. Like, for example, going into that game and going into warm-ups, they had a couple of extra bodies because it wasn't quite clear what was going to happen. But Ryan Strome was clearly nowhere near 100%. Ryan Strome probably shouldn't have played, but sometimes with veteran players in a critical game with elimination being involved, you don't want to come out, and you try to give it everything you got to make sure you stay in, and I totally get that. But you could tell that he was nowhere near 100%. Now we know it was a pelvis issue. Apparently it's been something he's been battling in the second half of the year. And when he was hurt earlier in the playoff round, it just became aggravated. So that's why it wasn't really clear. Some speculated it could be like a groin or something around like the mid area of the body. It seemed to be what was bothering him. He wasn't able to skate properly. Like you could tell his skating stride was off. It just wasn't like he wasn't himself. And it was pretty obvious right from the get-go. And not only that, Ryan Strome was banged up bad enough that he did not even finish the game. He left the game early, so they were short and forward. And on top of that, Gallant puts in Dryden Hunt to replace Kakko, who hadn't played in quite some time. He hadn't played since round 1, and here we are deep into round 3. So it had been a substantial period of time since Hunt was in the lineup. So yeah, I guess Gallant, you could say, pushed a lot of the right buttons all year long and did a great job with this team. Obviously, he helped them take some huge strides this year and get all the way to the Eastern Conference Final. Some people might think they overachieved a bit. Some people might think they're ahead of schedule. Call it what you want. It's a lot of things went right for the Rangers this year, and as much as they came close to winning the Eastern Conference, I think it's fair to say that they do have some work to do to make sure they have a better chance to win it next time. Now, of course, with all that said, though, how does Kakko feel about all this? We really don't know. Of course, hasn't been any comments from him specifically, but just a lot of attention here. Larry Brooks of the New York Post has an article out on this today, as well as a few others. Larry Brooks points out a valid point. We saw a similar scenario with Jesperi Kotkaniemi in Montreal last year. Of course, ended up getting scratched deep into the playoffs, and look what happened. He ended up leaving in the offseason, was eager to sign an offer sheet. Mind you, the money was pretty good on that offer sheet and knew he wouldn't likely get an offer like that from Montreal, and took advantage of it. Of course, the Rangers find themselves in another tight cap situation like many teams are. And you know what? They have a lot of tough decisions to make. And I don't think Kakko can really demand a ton of money really, theoretically, I mean, I would probably, if I was New York, would probably try to get my RFA business done ahead of, before they're officially into the time when they can even consider offer sheets. But you're probably looking at, I would say for Kakko, probably a 2-year deal at maybe 2.5 or something in that range. It's not going to be overly expensive. He hasn't put up a ton of points. He's still developing, still getting better. And I think there's still room for him to grow. But I do think it's fair to say his overall ceiling and expectations has been lowered compared to when he was first drafted. Until he can prove otherwise, it's just that simple. Will he get back to those expectations someday? Maybe. But right now it doesn't look like it. So you have to wonder if other teams are going to be interested here, even if the Rangers don't really want to trade him. But I know Elliot Friedman talked about this on the 32 Thoughts podcast that came out earlier today. And he indicated that he doesn't have any information to suggest the Rangers want to trade him, but he said that he would more than likely that Gallant and Drury were likely, obviously as they would anyways, evaluate players and talk about things here into the offseason in the next little bit, and I'm sure that they'll discuss their trust in this player, their belief in this player, and where he fits longer term, and make a decision before they get too far along with things. But regardless of what they think internally, it kind of sends a signal that maybe that they don't believe or trust in this player like they did before, and teams will inquire. It doesn't mean that they'll really consider much, but it's likely going to be a case here where the Rangers are probably going to get some trade offers for Kakko, just given the fact of what happened, and it wouldn't be shocking if an offer sheet did happen that he might be one of the targets. Obviously, if a team wants to overpay him on a 1-year deal, just like we saw with Koskinen, they want to throw $4.5 million at him on a 1-year deal for a team that can afford it, and then sign him to an extension after a little cheaper. If the results don't, justify it, then maybe that happens. I don't know. I'm not going to say it's going to happen, but it just seems to be suddenly the talk of the town here that Kakko could be the next offer sheet, could be Kotkaniemi 2.0, and we'll see where it goes. But I guess until we hear anything that Kakko wants out, I'm going to say a trade is probably not likely. But it doesn't stop teams from inquiring, and because of what happened, that the inquiries will likely be plentiful here in the coming days and weeks ahead. Now, there's also reports today that John Gibson wants out of Anaheim, and there's already counter reports denying that he has requested a trade. So what's true? It's probably somewhere in the middle. Usually when you hear these types of things, there is some truth to it, but sometimes that truth gets bent a little bit as well. So essentially we saw reports on Twitter today that Gibson had advised the Ducks that he would be okay with the trade. Of course, that could be a case where a player tells a team, essentially, I understand if you want to trade me, if, and some players obviously have some trade protection in their contract, I'll work with you, whatever, especially if you can get me to one of these teams or whatever. But doesn't mean he's saying, I want a trade and I'm not coming back next year. There is a difference between those two scenarios, and sometimes the reports get leaked out and they get a little bit, mixed signals on what was actually said or what was actually, the case. So I think in this case with John Gibson, I think it's fair to say that he would be open to a trade based on, because we've been hearing reports for quite a while that Gibson is a player that likely wants out of Anaheim, although hadn't officially requested it. He signed to a long-term deal. The last couple of years for him have been frustrating, with the team in decline and not really performing where he hoped they would be when he signed that long-term deal. We saw a mass exodus of his longtime teammates this year, all players on expiring deals that Pat Verbeek said he would trade if he didn't sign them. We saw Manson go, Lindholm, Raquel, and there's, Getzlaf's going to retire, or he's not coming back, so he's retired. So, and there's rumors on a few more that could go. So, really, this team is shifting gears here big time, and Gibson's getting into his later 20s with a decent amount of term left. To me, he's an excellent goaltender. I know some look at his stats and be like, oh, he's not the Gibson of old, but you can't really say that. I don't think it's fair to judge the goalie stats strictly on his own play. If you watch the Ducks games, you'll see that he's an amazing goalie. And honestly, I really think that put a better defensive team in front of him and put him on any of the teams that were in the playoffs, like any kind of remote cup contender, and I think he's an all-star. That's what I think of Gibson. But you think of teams like Edmonton, who certainly have questions in goal. We know Koskinen's gone, as I just talked about earlier. We know there's some cloudy future over Mike Smith. He might retire, or even he might end up on LTIR. That was another discussion on the 32 Thoughts podcast today, that if Smith doesn't want to retire, he might qualify for LTIR, because apparently he was banged up pretty bad and dealing with a ton of injuries that could justify it. So there is a possibility that the Edmonton Oilers might have a completely new and different goaltending tandem next year, and maybe that's a team that could make sense for him. A team like New Jersey makes a lot of sense. We know that they're expected to be aggressive. I don't know if that would be a case of the number 2 overall pick being involved in a trade, but we know that they're open to doing that, and goaltending has been a frustrating bone of contention for them that they need to solidify. Wouldn't even be shocked if Mackenzie Blackwood went the other way either, because obviously the Ducks would need a goaltender, and Blackwood is a little younger, and maybe he could find his game and a change of scenery more consistently. Might be good for both sides. In that case, I don't think we'd see a number 2 pick, but it might be more than Blackwood included. But, a team like Washington, we know, wants a veteran goaltender to solidify things. And there's others too. So to me, when it comes to goalies being traded this offseason, there's not much out there for high-profile goalies that would kind of classify or even be close to that elite level. And Gibson is probably one of the only guys really in that category, in my opinion. And there's not a ton of great goalies in the free agent market. There's a few really good ones, and obviously a guy like Fleury's out there who's really good and has been elite and could be elite again still at his older age. Darcy Kemper, another name out there. Ville Husso, some interesting names, but Gibson definitely will get most of the goalie attention for sure. So we'll see. His agents denied the fact that he wants a trade, but like I said, that could be the difference. Maybe he just said that he'd be okay with a trade and be open to a change of scenery. That could have got misinterpreted when the information is leaked out, so the agent denies it, which is technically the agent is not lying. They're telling the truth if he didn't ask for a trade, but it doesn't mean that he wouldn't prefer it or be open to it. So it's probably just a case of the wording. We'll see where it goes, but I would not be shocked, because I've been saying it for a while, that Gibson becomes on a new team here and is traded sometime during this offseason, likely ahead of the NHL draft or during the first round of the draft. And lastly here, I want to touch on Montreal Canadiens forward Josh Anderson. Now, Josh Anderson is, I don't think, a player that Montreal has set out to trade. We know that Ken Hughes and Jeff Gordon are going to be busy in reshaping this Habs team for the future, certainly heading towards a full-scale rebuild here. We're likely going to see a few more veterans moved out, but I don't know for sure that Anderson's going to be one of those guys, but he could be. According to Frank Saravalli, and I've also heard reports from Friedman mentioning the same sort of deal, that Anderson's getting attention and that teams are inquiring. Obviously, he's a big body guy who can play physical and score goals, solid 20-25 goal guy with a long-term deal. Does have some injury history to be a little bit concerned about, but nothing too crazy there. And obviously, by the time you get to the end of the playoffs, like we are now, teams are starting to see, maybe we could use a little bit more physicality or whatever. And these types of players tend to gain a little bit of interest because of that. Teams realize what they're missing. And Anderson could be a fit on several of the playoff teams that fell a little bit short this year. And I'm sure that there is interest. Whether or not that he gets dealt is difficult to say. I think this is the case where Montreal, are more likely to trade a guy like Petrie or Dvorak, are the more likely guys to go that are, a little bit more established. I don't see them really doing much in the way of their younger players. They obviously want to keep as many of them around as they can to start, deciding who's going to be on part of this new core moving forward. They have a few pieces there, but they need to add a few more. And so, like Hoffman's another guy who could go if the right deal comes along. And Anderson will be a little tougher to trade. I think they would like him to be one of the veterans that sticks around and helps the young guys. He does appear to be good with the younger players as well. So I do see value in Josh Anderson staying in Montreal. But basically the way Saravalli put it, he said that if a team wants to offer what he'd call a Godfather type offer, basically an offer they can't refuse, then it happens. But regardless if it happens or not, he is a player getting a lot of interest, and the Habs are going to have some options if that is something that they are inclined to possibly do. But I think they'll at least consider it. They have to see if they can make their team better for the future, but not a given any goes unless an offer comes along that's just too good to pass up, which is really the case with most players anyway. So let me know your thoughts on all of today's news and rumors down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.